I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Jenny Case from the University of Capetown here to HECU 8. Jenny has been a great friend of HECU for many years, been actively involved in a number of ways, and I think she shares with many of us a passion for this being a very special sort of conference, so we couldn't have a better speaker to kick us off. Just by way of a little bit of background, Jenny is holder of several important research grants and has written extensively and published in the areas of teaching and learning. She has a particular interest in chemical engineering, but actually expands that, and her work really has a lot to say to other areas of science and engineering, teaching and learning in higher education, and indeed to the sphere as a whole. She's also an international partner in the new Centre for Global Higher Education, and through that she'll be furthering her connections with Lancaster, which again we're very delighted about. She's passionately committed to improving teaching and learning in everything she does, and so she's, as I said, the perfect person to start us off with HECU 8. So welcome.
So thank you, Jan, for that warm introduction, and really I am enormously honoured to be doing this keynote today. Thanks, Paul. So I first came to HECU in 2001, and it changed my life. But actually, no, seriously, it did. I freshly armed with my PhD on approaches to learning, I arrived in this town ready to present that, and was very seriously challenged by a forward-moving approach to research in student learning, and felt that I had a lot of catching up to do, actually. And then I've come to HECU over the years, and my experience is it's always critically moving forward. Many strands that I've picked up in my own research I think I first encountered here. Also, just the collegiality of this community. I echo what Paul said. It's a small group. They dance after the conference dinner, which I'm sure is because all the South Africans who attend. But also, it's been some really good connections to people. So I look forward to some of you I know already, and then also to meeting new people over these next few days. So just to say, on the talk, I'm using the PowerPoint quite sparingly because I find it can be distracting. So if you're going to struggle to follow me, the full talk is actually at this bit.ly, 29UDJYG, or you could Google it. You might get to it. It's on the academia website. I mean, you may not want that, but just if you find my accent very odd, you might want to do that because I'll be following that text quite closely. And then mainly to say the talk, in a way, the title really suggests the two parts of the talk. The first quite substantial piece is really just trying to locate social justice and higher education conceptually. And then I will move to a part which is very much for the HECU audience about what does that mean for education research. So I'll try and signal that as we go along. And I think that's all I need to say on preliminaries. So hopefully we move on here. So I want to start with some extracts from a piece written by the former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, Professor Jabulo Ndebele, in November 2013. Not unaware of the long-standing debates about the location of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes on the UCT campus, and that is the location I'm showing you now in the picture from last week. These debates go back to the 1930s. Jabulo provides a very provocative engagement, I think, with the perspective that the statue is designed to invoke. So he starts by giving us this piece. A concrete balustrade just below Rhodes allows you to stand there, your back to him. You too can assume his pose. For a while, you might even experience the gaze of contentment. There, spread before you, is the world you had a hand in shaping. But Jabulo moves on to unsettle this more than a little bit. Although you and Rhodes command a view, the vista before you is too far and widespread to show its imperfections, and there is your look over the Cape Flats. At some time past, you may have read about, heard about, or seen smoke rising from rampant fires in the informal settlements of Kwalanga across the highway to and from the airport, and from further afield in the townships of Gugulethu and Crossroads. You might have contemplated lives charred and belongings incinerated, families traumatized, and you might recall the clamors of tragedy in the newspapers, on radio and television, of political accusation and counter-accusation, and stories of poverty and wealth deposited on the deliberative tables of commissions of inquiry. What is the relationship between the university and the world that surrounds it? The deliberate colonial siting and architecture of UCT embodies this idea in which the university is set apart from the world with an elevated view from which it can gaze upon and contemplate the world. And the location of UCT is very deliberately, and the design of the campus is designed with that view. It was built in the 20s. But Debele's inversion here of Rhodes's gaze to look closely at the misery that is also part of the colonial legacy, I think is a very useful introduction to our deliberations today on the relationship between higher education and social justice. The notion of social justice, just to give us some background, considers the distribution of wealth and related aspects of well-being in society as a matter of justice. And in contexts like the US and the UK, social justice tends to stand in for a broad critique of the neoliberal political project that is associated with an erosion of public institutions and an increase in income inequality, a rolling back of the post-war commitments of the social welfare state. So in these contexts, US, UK, and related Anglophone contexts of relatively high participation in higher education, questions around how class continues to impact on educational experiences and life opportunities have not been resolved, with elite institutions, as you know, continuing to draw largely from middle and upper classes. And widening participation, often it is argued, remaining more a policy statement than an empirical reality. So a social justice stance on higher education also provides us a starting point for a necessary pushback to a related set of justifications for higher education that sees higher education predominantly in instrumental and economic terms, focusing attention on issues of efficiency with educational outcomes characterized in evidence-based terms. In post-apartheid South Africa, it's actually relatively recently that social justice as a term has entered the lexicon of higher education scholarship. And this can be associated with a sharply growing sense that the democratic government has not been able to address the inherited inequalities from colonial and apartheid times. And as many of you know, both access and success to higher education in South Africa remain hugely skewed by race. Scholars such as Melanie Walker and Elaine Unterhalter have found value engaging particularly with Amartya Sen's critique of the concept of social justice as brought into contemporary times by John Rawls. In short, Amartya Sen finds Rawls' abstract, somewhat ideal notion of social justice of limited utility when faced with real-world contexts, specifically in the developing world where Sen has focused a lot of his work. In these contexts, ideals are seldom attained, but the necessity for moral judgments is really still important. So Sen offers us what can be considered a more close-up, I think, notion of social justice. It's grounded in his conceptualization of human flourishing, the possibility for humans to accomplish things that they value doing in life and being. I find that there's an immediate appeal in this notion of human flourishing and this definition around social justice, and it feels so very close to an intrinsic understanding of the purposes of higher education. But maybe to trouble this slightly and bring in a South African perspective, I want to stick my neck out a bit and say that in some ways our deliberations on higher education society with our maybe still colonized minds might be continuing to take their lead in this regard from debates in the UK and the USA. And certainly they face similar, but also very different societal, political, and economic challenges. And so in this talk, what I want to do is to go back to some foundational issues and try and build up from there. As a South African, I am speaking from a context that has unsustainable levels of social injustice. I am speaking as a person who had put faith in a political project that has manifestly failed us, most notably in the present crises we're experiencing, and the reality checks on how little has shifted from the colonial and apartheid legacy that we were bequeathed. These were systems that structured life opportunities for South Africans in distinct ways, depending on their ethnic backgrounds. These structures have largely not changed, even though we now have a democratic order. Black children still attend schools that are a little different to the Bantu education system that was the cause of the Soweto uprising some 40 years ago. We have a growing middle class, rapidly growing, of all races, but nearly half of our population is still excluded from stable livelihoods. Significant progress has been made in provision of housing and sanitation, but we still have statistics around maternal and child health that are completely out of kilter for a nation with our level of GDP. So it's therefore really not surprising that serious questions began to be asked by student activists in 2015, especially given that this was also the point where the broader political order began to unravel somewhat. But I want to argue in this talk that the answers are not straightforward. Yes, definitely, society needs to change, but how? And most crucially for this talk and us as an audience, what role should and could the university play in this regard? So from a number of different positions, I think we have compelling arguments that the university itself cannot be the locus for social change, the central locus for social change. And here I've been profoundly influenced by a recent piece by Robin Kelly, who's a UCLA professor and a committed activist, reflecting on recent student protests across US campuses. He writes, I really recommend this piece to you, by the way. Sorry, what I meant to get to was there. Recommend this piece, Black Study, Black Struggle. He writes of universities, as institutions, they will never be engines of social transformation. Such a task is ultimately the work of political education and activism. By definition, it takes place outside of the university. Coming from an almost polar opposite viewpoint, we have the somewhat iconoclastic Stanley Fish, who I think I first heard of in a talk in this conference. And in this provocative book, Save the World on Your Own Time, Fish argues that university professors should leave their political commitments outside the classroom. Whatever your political stripes, it is clear that the domain for societal change will be the political, whether in a system of democratic institutions or on the streets or both. The university cannot be a representative body. It cannot make policy. It cannot dispense health and welfare. So what can it do? And here we know the standard answer on what the university does: research, teaching, administration, social engagement. And we fill these boxes and check them. Impact, I should add, in your terms, UK terms. But these are the internal organizers for academic activity. What does the university do, and what should it do from the perspective of society? And in the first instance, I want to go to a perspective from a former South African Vice-Chancellor and a former HECU keynoter, Salim Badat, who says, in considering how do we find this meaning, he says the meaning of higher education universities cannot be found in the content of their teaching and research, how they undertake these, or their admission policies. Instead, the core purposes of higher education universities reside elsewhere. And then there's this really useful piece. He builds a really nice argument, pretty grounded argument on the relationship between university and society and the roles that the university plays. And I've reorganized his list a little bit slightly for my own purposes. Research and scholarship, I know it's quite pointedly he put it last, and I kind of support that, but I'm going to another list and I'd like them to sort of match up. So the production of new knowledge. Secondly, and here's 2 points, cultivative, highly educated people and also people with democratic mindsets. I would put those together. And a third about engaging with society, both on developmental needs and challenges and also with society's intellectual and cultural life, which I think are also useful to put together. So you can see these familiar themes. You can go, oh, there's the research one, there's the teaching one, there's social engagement. But I think the framing is now moving us more towards its external purposes. What does the university offer to society? But I want to take a further step back, though, and locate this contemporary framing within a broader perspective put forward by the historian and sociologist Manuel Castells. And here's Castells' list. So Castells notes that universities at all times and places have served these 4 different and potentially contradictory functions. But the balance and the form of these differs in particular periods. So his first purpose, and contrary to the view that's often espoused, and here we can just put Stanley Fish, therefore, off the page, Castells point out that universities have always served an ideological function. This tends to represent the dominant ideologies in society. But importantly, in the context of a repressive state, the university tends more to foster challenges to this domination in the form of counter-hegemonic ideologies. Secondly here, universities have always served as mechanisms in selection of dominant elites, like it or not. This is even so in our presently massified and even universal systems you see in many parts of the world, where the stratification within these systems preserves this function, as predicted by Trow in his 1973 piece. With regard to the third function, production of new knowledge, Castells notes, as is widely recognized, research is a relative newcomer to the university, emerging in the 19th century and intensifying significantly in our period, that we come to think it's the only thing the university is about. This intensification is not only due to the significance of knowledge in the globalized economy, but also, I think, and not well commented on, I think this intensification is related also to the context of increasingly cash-strapped universities looking for third stream income. The fourth and the final function, which Castells argues is most currently the most significant one, is what he terms, and I mean the terminology is a little bit of a shift from what we might be used to, training of bureaucracy. And Castells, with historical view, locates this firstly back to the early church schools. And then note there's a change in a form from the Industrial Revolution on, when industrialization required the production of engineers and other technically skilled personnel. And mass schooling and social welfare systems also required armies of school teachers, social workers, and so on. And I'm finding Castells' position particularly helpful in trying to tease out a view on higher education and social justice. So I know the word ideology maybe makes your hair stand a bit on end, but in the terms of what we use in here, social justice is an ideology. It is a counter-hegemonic ideology to the neoliberal discourse that has become so prominent across much of the Anglophone world, even hit our shores. So the ideology of social justice is an important extension, I argue, of the democratic commitment that Badat recognizes as a key function of the contemporary university. So in case you're feeling awkward about the term ideology, my understanding of Castells is here we have ideology as a view on how society should work, and in the context of the university, a view on what the roles of graduates should be in this regard. So, and I think this is maybe a point where I don't want to lose you at this part of the talk. As I say, that term ideology might be like, I don't believe in ideology or whatever. I think Castells is giving us a very straightforward view. There's always going to be an angle that the university is supporting around what society we desire and how we see our graduates fitting into that. We need to recognize that, and I maybe I should make entirely straightforward if it was not clear from my introduction, is that this is the ideology that I feel very committed to myself. So as noted though, this is the really important point. Castells emphasized these four functions are often in contradiction and tension with each other. So most obviously, the ideological function will not always sit easily with the others. With regard to production of new knowledge, there's the obvious contradiction. So ideology is the promotion and expansion of one key viewpoint, and new knowledge in university will often be about engaging in different and competing viewpoints. Furthermore, and I'm speaking particularly from the South African context and other related ones, particularly on my continent, if you have a society that is in some turmoil and competition about ideology, you will see this tension in the university. The trick, Castells argues, is for the university to meld these potentially contradictory functions together into some form that is reasonably compatible with the present times. And this will mean a periodic remaking of what the question, what is the university for? So this is why we must also always be, if someone said the university is X, and they're referring back to the medieval times, well, there are some aspects that are enduring, but there's so much in which the university is remade according to the changes in society. The remaking is crucial, and I think we're facing a challenge presently that is requiring some quite extraordinary scholarship and leadership in remaking the university. If we don't get this right, Castells is very clear about the risks. So he says the real issue is to create institutions that are solid enough and dynamic enough to stand the tensions that will necessarily trigger the simultaneous performance of these somewhat contradictory functions. The ability to manage these contradictions while emphasizing the role of universities in the generation of knowledge and the training of labor in the context of the new requirements of the development process will condition to a large extent the capacity of new countries and regions to become part of the dynamic system of the new world economy. He's writing here particularly in a global south context. So returning then to our focus here on social justice and higher education, let's maybe just sort of back up and make clear what I'm trying to say. It's of course a key point for ideological contestation in all of our present societies. And it is not surprising, as noted by Castells, that the university is a key site for protecting and expanding this counter-hegemonic discourse. And with Robin Kelley, and again Stanley Fish, it is entirely appropriate that students in their studies will be exposed to and expected to engage with what might be expected of our democratic societies and the degrees to which current arrangements are moving us either forwards or backwards. These are extremely powerful ideas, challenging ideas, and we do well if we can produce graduates who are critical and dissatisfied with the societies in which they find themselves. But, and here is the key but, the university, as Kelley notes, cannot be the central locus for effecting this change. We need to produce graduates that will go into the streets and or the boardrooms to act on the knowledge that they have taken in at the university. Here it is worth noting another inherent contradiction in the functions of higher education, as Castells outlines. We frame what we give graduates as tremendously precious and important, yet we work within a system that by definition can only extend these privileges to a portion of society. And as noted, even in a universal higher education system, you always get stratification, and therefore it is always a proportion of society gets this very elite version of higher education. So in the middle of one of our recent campus shutdowns, I found myself asking the question, can you run a functional university in a dysfunctional society? Well, of course you have to. So understanding the key functions outlined by Castells, there is no other institution, society that is placed to accomplish these functions. We have to keep our universities going, and most especially in more dysfunctional societal contexts. But Castells, surveying post-colonial Africa especially, notes the severe challenges in this context. What tends to happen in these contexts is that the ideological functions of the university come to dominate at the expense of others, most notably at the expense of the production of new knowledge and the necessary education of professionals for all domains in society. There's a particular irony there, in that if you have this situation where you have got a political or an ideological project that is limiting the university's capacity to produce professionals and new knowledge, this situation means that universities will not be able to achieve what Castells calls their developmental function, which of course will be centrally important if these societies are actually to accomplish the social changes that their ideological position might value, the building of strong and inclusive economies, the provision of services to the citizenry, and so on. So further analysis of the African post-independence context for higher education comes from the incisive work of Ugandan scholar Mahmoud Mamdani. In a piece delivered to South African academics on the eve of our democracy in '93, and noting early portents of what might come, Mamdani firstly urged us to abandon our idea of South African exceptionalism, the idea held by many South Africans at the time that we would somehow be exempt from the social, political, and economic difficulties that have plagued the post-colonial African context. Crucially then, in running through the course of events as experienced in his home university, Makerere, in the 60s, he shows how the prominence of an Africanist ideological position in the post-independent university had severe and crippling consequences for his ability to ultimately function as a university. And if you're watching the news, Mamdani is still fighting that battle decades on. Once the now fully Africanized university was fully subservient to the new nation state, it lost its autonomy, it could no longer hold together its functions, most especially in the domain of production of knowledge. Makerere, which was once the global site for intellectual ferment, became a stagnant pool. Reflecting on these events, Mamdani asked the assembled South African academics, are you condemned to suffer replay of the old African script, or are you in a position to learn from our experience? And you can give your own answer, 2016, of where did we go on that. So much closer to my home in Capetown, we also need to reference the key debate between Jakes Gerwels and Neville Alexander in 1987 at the University of Western Cape, UWC. Gerwels had famously and completely understandably declared UWC the intellectual home for the left, and you will understand this with any knowledge of the 80s in South Africa. Alexander, although most probably more radically left than most of the others in the room, stridently disagreed with this position, arguing that such a commitment, calling it the domain, intellectual home of the left, would condemn the university to becoming what he called a leftist Bantustan, using the term referred to the former homelands and apartheid era. Very provocative term there. Rather, that it would be a leftist Bantustan rather than being open to a broad set of ideas. Given the political move of the time, it's not surprising that Gerwel won widespread support for his position that the university allies itself with a particular ideological agenda. However, with the benefit of hindsight, Pramesh Lalu commented of this move, and he repeated aspects of this comment at a seminar at UWC about a month or two ago. Lalu, very senior academic in humanities, said, historian I think, it was a profound move, but it had some unforeseen consequences. The university continued to write itself into a marginal space. We were always lodged within a certain referentiality, always that, the other university of the left. It short-circuited other possibilities, and it gave rise to some dogmatic thinking. So back to Castells, and really trying now to move on to the second part of the talk is, what does this mean for us as education researchers? How might we hold together our contemporary commitment, which I understand being the commitment of the audience sitting here, since you came to a conference on higher education and social justice? How might we hold together that commitment in the face of a narrow neoliberal hollowing out of higher education? How might we hold that commitment alongside the other potentially contradictory functions that we might be called to serve, educating engineers? What especially will this mean, though, for us as higher education scholars and teachers? And in order to take this forward, what I found productive, and I've mentioned this in the Think piece, was the simple challenge posed in a recent keynote at ESA last year by Sharon Todd, Irish academic who challenged an audience of education researchers to be sure that they are asking educational questions. Are we asking the education questions? It's so attractive and it's so important that we're understanding the functions of education in society. But we are the people who understand more than others the internal functionings of education. And are we really pushing new knowledge in that area? We cannot evade our own role in generating new knowledge to broaden our understanding of these very significant challenges. And here I was struck by a recent comment of the higher education editor of a social media outlet, who noted how hard it was these days to get South African education academics to write about their research findings. In these heady times, everyone wants to write op-eds, but no one wants to make a contribution to the long haul. In order to expand on Todd's challenge, I'd like to refer to Castells again, and the broader context of his work that I used earlier on. So this came out from a very productive engagement with the Castells and a number of South African academics in 2000. There was a series of seminars that was arranged to engage with Castells' emerging work on the contemporary conditions of globalization, what he has termed informationalism and the implications for emerging economies such as South Africa, and in a special focus on education. Castells here lamented that South African academics seem stuck in the mode of asking how-to questions rather than the analytical focus that he deemed more important in research. Thus, in this seminar, all people wanted to talk about was how can we resist the pernicious impacts of globalization? And we're kind of critical of Castells saying we need to understand this moment. Analytically, we need to know what is happening. What are the constraints and enablements of these conditions we found ourselves in? And I think part of this maybe one could say quite instrumental approach might be related, and sorry if this is uncomfortable to say, but to maybe an over-prioritizing of the ideological mode. And Castells is very frank in his assessment of this mode of academic work. He says provocatively, what is to be done each time an intellectual has tried to answer this question and seriously implement the answer, catastrophe has ensued. So therefore, we need to ask analytical education questions. And here I do think that our ideological, what I'm terming, commitment to social justice is actually a potentially rich and productive store. It's a useful metric for a contemporary society in which it's often hard to find a moral compass. But we need to use this to frame educational questions rather than rhetorical statements or prescriptions for action. And I am as good as the best of them at writing prescriptions and rhetorical statements, mea culpa. So in a broader sense, this flagging of social justice, I think, also links with calls by Lancaster's Andrew Sayer and others for the bringing back in of normative concerns to social science. There's also, I think, a rich emerging literature on the public good purposes of higher education. And I think this also offers us a more nuanced framing of the normative that can guide our deliberations in higher education. A really important point to make, though, at this juncture, us sitting in our little higher education bubble, is that any real discussion of social justice in society would need to center on the full post-secondary education system, not just higher education. This, I think, is a very significant problem presently in the South African discourse on the matter. And there's recent compelling evidence from the OECD around the crucial, although complex, role of vocational education in advancing social equality in the long term, and specifically looking across a range of different European contexts. The UK is not rated so strongly in that regard. So, yeah, that's Busameyer. So there's a growing in higher education. Of course, what we are aware of is a very good scholarship tracking the dramatic expansion of participation in higher education, particularly in Asia over recent times. The trend is really unstoppable. And I mean, anyone who thinks in South Africa that participation is not going to grow is living in some dream world. It is. It's driven, as people like Marginson argue, mainly by the aspirations of families than by government fiat. So these are times, I think, to make sure the questions we're asking of higher education, which is changing rapidly, to make sure the questions we ask are not trapped in thinking of the past. So I try to, and I really have to confess, when I stop to think for myself, write analytical research questions. And within this framing, I stopped to think critically of quite a few of my own research endeavors. So I did an attempt at making, what do I mean by this? What would be research questions that I think are of the analytical level we need, and where you can see how social justice gives a framing for sort of what side is up, but where we're still trying to ask questions and not just ask how-to questions. So some of these are, as I've written here, what are the particular dynamics of the expansion of higher education? I'm asking for myself in South Africa. Very interesting context. It's a system that massified early on for a small racially defined segment, the 60s and 70s, but now it is moving to broader massification across the whole population. Very interesting dynamics, not necessarily seen elsewhere. Higher participation presently than most other sub-Saharan contexts, even when you look at the ethnic segments with the lowest participation. Significantly, how can we understand the protests of 2015 in this context? And I find actually Tra's original analysis very provocative here about some very necessary tensions that arise as you massify the university. It's not only about resource constraints, it's also about the nature of the university. What are the forms of capital? And I've tried to answer this to some degree in some of my work, that South African students from less privileged backgrounds are drawing on in order to succeed in higher education. Crucially for many of us in academic development, what are the forms of pedagogy that are supporting the needs of these students? And then interestingly for me in present work, what do graduates make of the knowledge and dispositions that the university has fostered in them? How do they translate these into their lives post-university? So to wrap up then, in terms of addressing what I think are central and burning educational questions of these very challenging times we live in, I want to argue in the HECU spirit that the contribution of close-up research sadly is still completely undervalued. This is a world that wants metrics, rankings, and statistical correlations. In higher education, I speak from my editing life especially, I want to be bold enough to say that yet another study which shows how students with high levels of motivation or self-efficacy or self-regulation or whatever, that these students perform better academically. I don't think we need more studies of that sort. Because there are really important questions that we are not addressing, and partly because they require an audience that is sophisticated enough to understand complex causality. Researchers need to be able to build explanatory accounts which draw on close-up data, but in analysis are able to locate these findings carefully in a historical and social context. We need to find ways to work with large sets of narrative data. That's the challenge I'm grappling with myself presently. We need to become more sophisticated in using observational and documentary data. We need to learn to work comparatively across contexts in a close-up mode. We need to listen very closely to student voices. At the same time, we need more than ever to avoid the epistemic fallacy, which takes people's accounts of the way things seem to be the way they are. It's very difficult, I think, to make sense easily of the challenging and fast-moving times in which we live in. There's much work to be done in interpreting findings and then presenting these to multiple audiences. If the world out there has been raised on a diet of metrics and correlations, then the duty is going to fall on us as higher education scholars to raise the level of the conversation. In this regard, I'm really looking forward to HECU 8 2016. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny. We've got a good bit of time now for questions, so I'll just open the floor to questions. Well, I'll start with one then, if I may. Chair's prerogative. Jenny, you were talking about how really for change, the university couldn't do it all. It had to be in terms of what happens when students leave. But are you in suggesting that? Are you saying, though, that the university does have to do something different than it currently is to enable that to happen? And I'm sort of thinking, are you talking beyond simply sort of the set notions of graduate attributes there to something else? Could you sort of tell us a little bit more about that?
Should we take a few questions and comments?
Yeah, if you'd rather, that'd be a good idea. Kelly at the front here.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that, Jenny, so thank you very much. I think you posed some really great, provocative questions in there about things that I find very uncomfortable about working in the contemporary higher education context. But you mentioned the student voice at the end, but I just wondered to what extent universities are there to give students the chance to ask their own provocative questions and to have that space. I mean, student protest movements have been important for society for several decades. And I just wondered to what extent we let them shape the questions more. I mean, you talked quite a lot about us and how we shape our questions, but I just wanted to hear what you have to say about that.
Can you introduce yourself? Sorry, I don't know you.
Well, ideology.
So, are you on?
Sorry.
Your name is
Philip.
Sorry?
Philip.
Philip, thanks.
Well, ideology. So, I would like to understand more. You have discussed about ideology both as a positive and as a negative force within the university. And I am thinking within a given context, within a cultural context, you have options. You have options in terms of ideologies. And you have options to create something new, I guess. Could you maybe give us a context of like what the ideological options are in South Africa? What the field is in which you make these options. Thank you.
There's another one at the back.
It might be saying the same things, Philip, in a slightly different way, but I'd understood you to say that Castells said the university is a space for counter-hegemonic activity of some sort, because universities are very kind of plural places, and that as institutions it would be hard, I think, as you've conveyed, to kind of think of them as counter-hegemonic at the moment. So where might the spaces be in universities to be challenging?
Oh, there's another couple.
Second row.
I think maybe this also builds on Monica's question. I wonder if you can say something about the sort of seductive nature of that neoliberal discourse, because if the real calls for change are coming from the students, and even calls for revolution, but they themselves are slipping into and drawing on those kind of neoliberal discourses, there's a real tension there, which I guess is what Mamdani was talking about as well. I wonder if you can speak to that.
And did you? It's just one here at the front.
I think I'm just asking the question about maybe from your reading of Castells, who says we should create institutions solid enough, dynamic enough. Just wonder if he gives us some kind of a magic wand.
Okay, that's the easiest question. There's no magic wand. It's the only question I can answer with great ease. But yes, I mean, the neoliberal world is a world of magic wands, because you can measure it, then you can have a strategic driver, and we can all go into lever. Thanks for that very wonderful set of comments. And I don't have a simple answer because I'm really grappling. I have sweated blood and tears over this keynote because I find this a very challenging space. And I think maybe to start with the questions, Philip, Monica, Sue as well. Yeah, so I think there is an important correction. If I suggested that the university will have one ideological position, of course, that's also, there will be contestation of ideology in a university as well. But I think, and it's so important not to kind of suddenly talk about the whole globe. I'm very much, my knowledge is mostly of a few contexts, and my own specifically. And I think that actually part of the problem, Sue, you really hit the nail on there, is that in our, I've come of age as an academic in post-apartheid South Africa in these first 20 years, and I guess it seemed so straightforward for this period of, we knew why we were in the university, we knew the broader project we were committed to. And many of us felt that we had the government and the political leaders. It was lined up, and the challenges were there on the ground, but it seemed like we all knew what we were doing. And that has really blown wide open. But I think, Sue, your caution is a crucial one, because I'm finding, if you want to, and I'm no political scientist, and I do understand that people can use the term neoliberalism sloppily. Someone in this room has ticked us up on that. But, and I always thought it was something nasty that happened over in the UK, and I was waiting for the time it came to us. It has crept in its most insidious ways into a context everywhere, and it has arrived with a force on some of our university campuses. And obviously, in the context of resource constraints, it comes to really operate. And there's a combination of a supposedly political progressive view with a instrumental managerial underpinning that I find absolutely lethal. and I don't have a good way of talking about that yet, but it's something I've been living through. And so therefore, it talks of the importance of theoretical work around ideology, even within the university, to be able to smell out these things, to be able to understand, to be able to be critical around policy within the university and more broadly as well, because I think we're having to rework a critical space on that. It's a complete reworking in South Africa for me. So, maybe to come to Philip's a very crisply framed question, am I talking ideology as a positive, as a negative force? And I suppose, I can't imagine being in a university that doesn't have a general sort of lefty feel about it. That's the university that we've all grown up in, been schooled in, and then worked in. But I can imagine there are other parts of the world where it maybe doesn't have that specific feel. But I'd say that might also mask deeper commitments that are less progressive. I think what I read with Castells and then really stridently with Mamdani, and I'm finding these post-colonial scholars very powerful. If you want to read people like Edward Said as well, others, you can take a little slogan from them and put it on a poster and feel very revolutionary. But if you read their work all the way through, it's devastating in terms of a very pertinent critique of the conditions we live in abuses of power that have continued and just taken on different forms. So I think that, I don't want to, Castells used the word repressive state, okay, and we're not living, there are some other contexts globally where I think that is a much more explicit label, but we might talk about a broader society where I mean, the dominant forces in society are not honoring their democratic commitment as we may understand a deep democratic commitment to be, then my own personal would be to fully support that there is ideological richness in the university that is a challenge to that, what you could call counter-hegemonic discourses. But I think the caution even then, and this is the very uncomfortable space for this audience, is that when everything, because somehow in the ideological space and what I've experienced is there's kind of an assumption, and I mean political discourse is like this, everything sort of lines up together. And all things can be made to serve a certain purpose. And the university is not that kind of animal. You know, I mean, maybe I really don't know if I should be too specific about examples, but let's imagine a university where there's a call for dealing with worker rights. And so we shut down the university for 2 weeks while we negotiate worker rights. And if you want to go social justice, that's yay. It's very significant in terms of social justice, advancing social justice for the workers in the university. But what is a 2-week shutdown, which was argued to be necessary to deal with that very significant issue? What would it mean for a university? And I'm not just doing a thought experiment here. Yeah, let me stop. As you can see, I don't think these things are easy, and I suspect there's others are going to take these questions forward much better than I can. Jan and Kelly, you know, and student voice. Now, I mean, the sort of HECU space has been certainly driven by, we have to understand students' experience. I mean, whether you were in approaches to learning or if you went through literacy's narrative or post-structuralism, that was the data that we thought mattered. And I think that work has been really important. I continue to think it's important, and I know that I've seen that looking at the abstracts for this conference, there's going to be some really interesting things on the table. I think what has been very hard to reconcile is many different, what do we mean by student voice? And if we say student voice is what students, activist students say in a mode of protest, I don't think you can ignore that, obviously. It's a particular voice, but it is a particular voice that is a different one to sitting down and interviewing a student about their experience. I mean, by definition, they're different. And I think we were kind of a little bit muddled in that space. So we suddenly got like, oh my word, you know, there's issues. I don't want to say that the research had ever covered everything. I think that quite likely some student learning research was maybe sort of politically cautious, certainly not wanting to deal with race. I think that would be true of a lot of work. But I think that in getting caught up in trying to respond to that, we also got, I think there's work to do going forward in this, to be honest. So I've really struggled with the sort of public or the sort of popular space of saying the students. I mean, there's no group called the students at any university. There are multiple voices, and some people have a lot of voice. Social media is very, very interesting. So it advances a voice, particular voices, but I mean, talking particularly to students I'm teaching on the ground, it's unfortunate that this last period at my university, for a lot of students have felt quite silenced. And I'm kind of hoping that we get on to a next round of student movements that can work with plurality and possibly some contestation. There's a maturing of that space that I hope, I don't want to sound reactionary here. I just mean to say nothing, you know, anyone who thinks, okay, yay, we arrived, now everything's, I think something very complex opened up. And there's important work to do going forward. So, I mean, Jan, your point, and you put it really nicely, you know, the university can't do it all. Okay? So the university can't change society. But if it's going to do the work in producing graduates who can go and change society, then it may need to shift some of what it does. And I really support that. So, I mean, in terms of change in the curriculum, I mean, there's some current flags that people might find productive or not. But I really find if we're not connecting with this change in society and what it might mean for our graduates and the enhanced need for critical engagement, I don't need to rehearse the arguments that, of course, information is everywhere. And so we're not training people to have particular procedural kind of bits of information in their heads, but to be able to work in unknown or less understood areas. And certainly the particular role of the university in providing a conscientizing space for students is huge. And I mean, I'm excited to see that we've arrived at a new phase in that regard. It's very significant for many people of my generation in South Africa. Now we're in a new phase of that. Yep. Magic wand, no. Any other questions and comments? I wish.
Well, can I just thank Jenny again then? And as Paul said, the whole point of HECU is to have a conversation. And I think Jenny has started us off with many very rich, although complex and difficult to grapple with, themes and threads to take forward over the next couple of days. So thank you again, Jenny.